My name is Kelly Shields and I'm the Learning and Operations Executive here in Legal Island. I'm joined by our chairman, Barry Phillips. Before heading up Legal Island, Barry specialised as an employment lawyer in London, Northern Ireland and Dublin. With such extensive knowledge, he's ideally placed today to pass on his tips and advice from the other side. What I plan to do is ask Barry to start his presentation and then we'll take some questions. At any time during the webinar, feel free to email me your questions to kelly@legal-island.com. We can't promise to get through all the questions during today's webinar, but we will get back to you individually afterwards. Presentation should take around 30 minutes, so sit back, relax, enjoy, and Barry, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Thank you for that introduction, and good morning to everybody that is joining us in the webinar this morning. What I want to do right at the beginning is to start by trying to explain to everybody how it is that small cases and small incidents in the workplace can escalate and become big issues very, very quickly. And to do that, what I need to do is to take you into that darkened place that is the employment lawyer's office, and to try and explain a few pressures that are on the employment lawyer, which will account for the direction and the nature of the claim and what it's going to look like at a very early stage. Before I do that, however, I just would like to ask everybody this simple question. And the question is this: what do you think is uppermost in a lawyer's mind immediately after taking on a new client and case? And you should see on your screen there that you have three options. And the first that you may wish to select as an answer is the money that can be made. The second is the current caseload. And the third is the risk of getting sued. So if you'd just like to indicate what you think is the answer to that, once we have the answers in, I will then respond to them. And it's interesting that 100% of you have said it's the risk of getting sued. Now, normally people answer to that, it's the money that can be made, because perhaps people realise that lawyers are in business as well. But that's exactly the right answer. It's the risk of getting sued. And I've certainly worked alongside a lot of solicitors and barristers. And it was evident to me that throughout their working week, that was uppermost in their mind. And it's a really important issue. And it may come as a surprise to some people that lawyers who spend most of their working lives suing others fear that most. But in a way, it makes sense, because obviously if an action comes back the other way, it's very professionally embarrassing. But it's also very bad for business. But the truth of the matter is that it is actually really quite difficult to stake a claim of negligence on a lawyer. And the reason for that is that there's no one correct way of doing a case. Some lawyers may actually think, okay, they'll hold back and they'll let the guns go when they actually get to the hearing. They might instruct a very good barrister or senior counsel. Another solicitor may think, well, actually, no, most cases are won and lost on the paperwork, and will request a lot of documents from the other side and information to get an indication before they actually get to the hearing of just how strong or weak the opposing side's case actually is. There's one area in which this Latin phrase is very applicable and relevant, and that is the Latin phrase of res ipsa loquitur, which means the matter speaks for itself. And law students, typically in their first year at university, love to use this phrase because it does make them sound very clever, but it effectively means that it's not really necessary to provide much evidence against a lawyer that they have been negligent. But the matter speaks for itself. They will be found negligent if they miss a time limit. And it's this issue of time limits that's really important to understand, coupled together with the lawyer's obsession for not getting sued. And I'll talk about time limits in a moment, but I have another question for everybody. And the question is simply this: Generally, the time limit for most common types of employment claims in Ireland and the UK is how long? So if you just like to indicate what you think the answer is, whether it's 3 months in both jurisdictions, 3 months in the UK and 6 months in Ireland, or 6 months in both. So if you could just choose between one of those three options there, and as soon as the answers are in, I will just take you through to the answers, just waiting for a few more to respond there. Some people find this is quite a difficult, tricky one. Others find it quite easy. And from the answer, it's suggesting to me that you found that question quite easy because everybody has got it right. And of course, the answer is that in the UK, it's a 3 months time limit, not in all employment claims, but in most cases. And in Ireland, it is 6 months. Again, not in all types of claims, but in most cases, it is 6 months. And the significance of this is simply this, that with such a short time limit, and with the lawyer so concerned about not getting sued, then you can understand that these sorts of things take off pretty quickly. And you might have a situation in which an employee or an ex-employee of yours goes to a lawyer, and perhaps it's taken them a month or two to go to see them, that first particular meeting. And the lawyer realizes that he's just got 4 months to go to make sure he doesn't miss that time limit. And rather than risk it, perhaps he's going to be busy with big cases coming up, he decides almost as soon as the employee leaves the office that that day is the day to issue and start the litigation process. A final thing I just want to talk about here under this heading of how small things become big things very quickly is what I've called the fear of a missed action. And by that, what I mean is this, that a lawyer doesn't want to go to a hearing, and as the evidence comes out in that hearing, to suddenly realize that he or she has missed a particular action. And for example, a lawyer may have what he thinks is quite a straightforward dismissal action that he's advancing. And when they get to the hearing, evidence comes out, and it becomes apparent from the evidence that there may be an issue, that the dismissal was, for example, a pregnancy dismissal, or for reasons of somebody's race or religion. And then the lawyer is going to be in the embarrassing situation of going to have to ask at the hearing and say, well, can he actually add some actions on at that very late stage? And there's a good chance that he may be refused that permission to do so in the hearing. With some force, the person running the hearing might say, well, I'm sorry, Mr. Phillips, you're too late. You should have advanced that claim a long time ago to give the other side adequate notice and an adequate opportunity to defend that particular claim at the hearing today. And so what a lawyer is likely to do is to, if you like, over-claim or overload the complaint form, really just to protect his position as much as to advance the position of his client. And what's important to understand here is there's no such thing as an overloaded complaint form. A solicitor can't be reported to the Law Society or won't be fined at the hearing because he's put on 8 actions when only really 3 or 4 were ever serious runners. So to protect himself, the lawyer is likely to overclaim rather than under, because the lawyer will know he can take claims off at the hearing, but putting them on at a late stage is a very difficult thing to do. So to sum up those 3 points together, what's uppermost in the lawyer's mind is the risk of getting sued. With time limits so short in Ireland and even shorter in the UK, and with the fear of the missed action, perhaps you can understand how it is that something small in the office can move very quickly because of the lawyer's concern for time limits. And by the time that complaint form lands on your desk as the HR officer, it's almost unrecognizable from the very small incident that you were familiar with and saw in the workplace several weeks ago. And that, I think, is important to remember. And I have a lot of sympathy for HR people when they receive that complaint form and they are accused themselves of things like sexual discrimination or race discrimination and so on. It's a very hard thing to be accused of, and I fully understand why it is at that point that very often the parties will think, okay, before we might have thought about trying to settle this and trying to get to some agreement and to be amicable with the other side, now we see this complaint form. We don't want to be at all sympathetic. All we're looking to do is to get ahead on a spike here and revenge and reply to this allegation or these allegations with everything that we've got. So that's a bit of context, which I'm hoping that those in the webinar will have found useful. Time to go for a Q&A session. I can see from Kelly that she's nodding to me that we've already got one question in, and I think another looks like it's on its way. So the question that I have, Kelly, can you read it out for us there, please?
All right, it's can you get legal aid for employment cases?
Okay, for employment cases, what we typically know as employment cases, the answer to that is simple, and that's no. Both in Ireland and in the UK, there has been discussion for many, many years, possibly decades, in terms of whether legal aid should be given to employees or ex-employees in employment law cases. But it's right to say that in both jurisdictions it's not available. And I would also be prepared to speculate that in the next 5-10 years, it's highly unlikely to be available in either jurisdiction. It never seems to get much traction as an argument, and though the lawyers talk about it and the need for it, it just doesn't seem to be on any politician's agenda for it to be introduced at any point soon. Is there a second there, I see?
There is indeed. It's quite an interesting one, actually. Oisin has sent in this question, which I'm sure everybody would like to know the answer to. I certainly do. Do you think the adjudication system in Ireland for employment cases favours the employer or the employee?
Good question, and thank you, Oisin, for that one. I suppose that all depends on which direction you're coming from. I've worked with a number of employees, and with some force they said, well, look, I'm out of a job now and I'm not financially in a position to hire a lawyer. So they would say that the adjudication system is stacked against them because, of course, when they go to a hearing, although the hearings are designed to be operated by those who are not lawyers, lawyers are a very familiar sight in employment law hearings. So the applicant or the employee is likely to say, well, this is unfair. I don't have the means to instruct a solicitor and or barrister. The other side does. On the other hand, employers, I hear, will shout and say it's far too easy for employees to have a go at them and to take a claim. And they would, and often do, say that it's stacked against the employer. So I'm afraid, Oisin, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to sit on the fence a little bit there and say it really depends. Okay, thank you for those questions. I want to go on now to look at the three essential tips. But just before I do that, I'd just like to take everybody through this slide and want to follow, just to remind everybody of the damage that litigation can do in a workplace. The first one there is that, of course, it can be very disruptive and damaging to morale. Many years ago, I worked in an office in London, and I can remember the first day that I walked in, I just was conscious of an awful atmosphere in the office, and it was only a couple of weeks afterwards that I realised that somebody was claiming harassment against a colleague. And that, I think, accounted for the dreadful atmosphere that was in that working environment. There was effectively two camps. Some had sided with the person who made the allegation, some were siding with the person against whom it was made, and there was just a dreadful atmosphere. It's very disruptive because, of course, witness statements often have to be taken from staff. They have to be designated to attend hearings, and sometimes hearings can involve 5-10 witnesses, so it can be very disruptive and expensive in terms of opportunity costs, and lost time. Legal fees, they're never cheap. There's the issue of loss of reputation, which I think in Ireland can be a big one, because of course Ireland's a small place, and as an employer, if you get a reputation as a bad employer, or reputation as an employer that's constantly fighting various types of litigation, then that can be very difficult to remove. Awards, they can be substantial. Just recently, I did a quick trawl of recent harassment claims, and there's no indication, despite all the changes that have recently taken place to the adjudication procedures, that awards are getting any less. There's the award there of C against A. I don't have time, unfortunately, to go into the details of these, but a relatively small harassment issue, an award there of 33,000. The one there of 54,000, and a third, again, not a particularly severe example of harassment, did nonetheless lead to an award of £30,000. So the three essential tips that I'd like to pass on to you today, and these have come, as Kelly has said, from me working as a lawyer, suing organisations like yours, and really very often coming away from a hearing thinking that was too easy, and wondering why it was that it was almost like an employer was insisting on presenting an open goal to my client to have a go and to kick the ball and get it in the back of the net, and very often they did. So I want to take this opportunity to try and explain how I think you can close down that goal. I'm not going to say it will make you bulletproof to litigation, but what I will say is that it will hopefully reduce the amount of litigation and make it much easier for you to defend litigation when it does come in against you. So the first thing that you need to do, and this is number one of the three essential tips that I'd like to give you, I think you need to do a complete equality and diversity audit in your workplace. And that requires you to do three things. You have to make sure that you have an up-to-date equality policy. You have to ensure that the policy has been actively embedded into your organisation and communicated to staff. And third, you have to be sure that your workforce does regular training on equality and diversity issues. The first of those, I think, doesn't require much explanation. What I would say there is that when I was a practicing lawyer, the first thing I used to do if I was acting on a discrimination case was simply ask for a copy from the other side of their equality policy. And sometimes it would come through, it'd be very up to date, and it would mention the 9 grounds of discrimination. Sometimes it would mention just 3 or 4, and you would realise it was badly out of date. Now, that didn't guarantee that you were going to win your claim, but it did guarantee that the opposing side would have to come to the hearing on the back foot, because you could be sure that should be the first question that you should be asking them. So equality policy, make sure it's up to date. In terms of number 2, and making sure that it is actively implemented in the workplace, I just want to refer you to a statutory instrument, and that's number 208 of 2012. And that contains some very good guidance on how it is that you can embed your equality policy into your organisation. It's important, of course, to communicate it to staff to make sure that your policies cross-reference your equality policy. And the third thing is the equality and diversity training. Now, something I want to say right at the start here, that in the old days of defending employment cases, and by the expression old days, I mean pre the advent and the popular use of the internet, I think those that were conducting hearings had a lot of sympathy for employers who said, I'm sorry, but we have so many employees, or they're so dispersed over so many different branches or depots or what have you, that it's logistically impossible to train our staff. They might say, for example, that they would go to a trainer, and the trainer would say, I can only take 20 staff at one time for half a day, and I'm only available for these half days in the next 6 months. And if there was like 800 staff, you could see that the hearing would be very sympathetic and would understand why it is or was that that workforce couldn't logistically be trained. Not so, not anymore, because with the advent of the internet and e-learning, hearings understand that this sort of compliance training is actually quite easy for employers to do. And what I want to show you is just a quick example of e-learning that Legal Island has developed for the labour force in Ireland. And what we have here is a module that takes about 50 minutes to complete, and it goes through all the main components of equality and diversity issues. And the great thing about it is that in real time, the activity is recorded on a website which the HR person will have access to. So at any one point, you can see who has completed the training and who hasn't. And perhaps most importantly, who has passed the assessment and who has not. And that training is, of course, done at the employee's convenience. They will do it, and after 50 minutes, they'll have an assessment. If they pass the assessment, they will get a certificate indicating that they've passed the assessment, and also a record of that pass will go onto the website that can be used. And if ever the employer was taken to a hearing, then the first thing that they would do, if asked for evidence of the training, is simply to print out a PDF record from the website of the training and who's done it and who has passed the assessment. This sort of equality and diversity training is very important in the area of harassment, because the hearing will look for evidence that the employer has been proactive and has done everything they reasonably could have to make sure that an incident of harassment never took place in the first instance. And that's why these 3 steps are really important. But these 3 steps are also important in many other types of equality and discrimination claims. For example, if I was claiming that somebody was overlooked for a promotion through a reason to do with their gender or something, it'd be equality action, and I would ask for a copy of the equality policy and for evidence of the fact that the equality policy had been properly implemented, and I would ask for evidence of recent training. So it applies to all sorts of actions, not just harassment, and that's why, for me, it's such an important area, and it's an obvious area to do some work in if you're looking to reduce the amount of claims and successful litigation that will come in against you. So we're at another Q&A session. Over back to Kelly, and Kelly's nodding again, telling me we've got some more questions in. So Kelly, over to you.
Great, thanks, Barry. Just in relation to that training you were mentioning about, a question has come in here to say, is it okay to train just the senior team and managers on equality and diversity issues. And I'm assuming some organisations will feel that they train their senior team and then that can be filtered down to the rest of the employees. But what they're saying is here, they're too big to do all staff.
In a word, I think the answer to that simply is no. If you're looking to be really robust against these types of claims, it's not enough to say it was a senior team that was trained in this, or senior teams and management, because as we all know, discrimination and harassment issues come from all sorts of parts of the workforce, not just the senior hierarchy. So it really has to be everybody. And as I touched on earlier, the hearing will want to see evidence of everybody having been trained, because logistically that is now possible and reasonable to ask and expect.
And just one final question, Barry, because I know that you've got a lot more content to cover. And again, we will get back to those questions that we haven't been able to answer during the webinar individually. Maeve has asked here, is it necessary to have employees sign the equality policy to prove that they've seen it?
Thanks for that, Maeve. Another good question. It's not necessary. It's not essential. It's better if you have got it. It could save you a bit of legwork when it goes to tribunal, of having to prove that the person making the complaint had actually seen the policy. So I suppose the answer to that is it's better if you have it, but it's not going to be fatal to your defence if you don't have it. The only consequence of not having it, is that you're going to have to provide, if you like, supplementary evidence just to convince the hearing that that person had seen the equality policy. I know that during onboarding, for example, a lot of times the employer will show the employees certain policies, and the equality policy is one of them. And after the onboarding has taken place, perhaps in the first week, they may be asked to sign a form to say that they have read the following documents and so on. So if you could capture the signature at that stage, then certainly that would be an advisable thing to do. Okay, so unless there's any other things there, we can just move on. And this is must do item number 2 that I'm suggesting. And this is that I'm suggesting to people and those in HR that they choose mediation over grievance procedures. And the reason I'm advising this is because I'm not a great fan of grievance procedures. I don't know why it is that they first came into the workplace, and where from, and what the history is in workplace relations and trying to resolve workplace disputes. But I can honestly say, and having worked in workplace issues for like 10 years, I've never seen an incident in which I think a grievance procedure has helped to resolve a workplace dispute between two employees. In most situations, it seems to have made it much, much worse. There's such a destructive process, and it just seems to me that you get two parties, one lodges a grievance against the other. They then go to their respective corners, they meet in the middle, and they batter hell out of each other. There has to be a winner, there has to be a loser. And very often the loser will leave the organization, and that often can be a great pity, because it may just be that that was actually a very good employee that you had there, but for some reason they just couldn't get on with another employee. Sometimes too, both employees will leave because there's been such a bad or so much damage to the working relationship as a result of the grievance procedure that both leave and look to go elsewhere. So there's costs of replacement of employees there, as well as having to do hearings, having to get an investigator in, and so on. So my advice there is to choose a mediation over a grievance procedure. And what we use at Legal Island is what we call a resolution procedure. And that's simply a procedure that has a very strong emphasis on mediation at the beginning. And it encourages parties to think about mediating rather than grievating. And it's only if they don't agree to mediate that they're then presented in that document at the back in the appendix, a standard grievance procedure that they can use. If anybody would like a copy of our resolution procedure, please email Kelly. It's available free of charge. You could take a look, and if you felt it was something that you'd like to work into your organisation, then feel free to do that. The third and last item is this. It is all about employee voice, and those organisations that I worked with, the small employers, the medium-sized employers, and the large employers, it just seemed to me that those that had the least problems with litigation seemed to be those that communicated well from staff, and in particular listened to staff. And it's this listening to staff that I just like to talk about. This is not me wearing, I suppose, my legal hat or my legal wig. This is more a management or structural organizational issue that I want to talk about. But it has a very definite bearing on the amount of litigation that you can expect if you get this right or if you get this wrong. And I just want to talk about this very large organization that I was familiar with when practicing. And I got to understand how they did employee voice in their organization. And it was really quite impressive. What they used to do was to have a day out with staff. I can't remember whether it's all staff or whether it was selected groups of staff members. But they'd get a lot of staff members in a room, and they would put up on a flip chart 3 categories: an individual category, a small group category, and an all staff category. And they'd say to them, list all the mechanisms that we have in the company at the moment for you to feed back and for you to have your voice heard to those in management and at the senior side of the company. And they'd list them, and there I put examples: meet the board days, staff suggestion box, 360 feedback, and so on. Then they would ask everybody to list all the small group mechanisms. So that might be the managers' meetings, it might be departmental meetings, ad hoc feedback sessions. Then there'd be the all staff mechanism and channel, and they'd list those options like the staff satisfaction survey, strategy development days, and so on. And the question put to staff would be, is that enough? If it's not, then the staff would be invited to suggest other mechanisms that could be used to make sure that their voice was heard well and thoroughly and often by the senior echelon of the company. One mechanism that this company used a lot was stop, start, continue. And you may have heard of this. Just in case you haven't, I'll just explain very quickly what it is and how it works. The idea of this is that you get employees into a room and you have 3 separate walls and give them lots of post-it notes. And on one wall, they're invited to put up what it is that they would like the company to stop doing. On another, what they'd like the company to start doing, and on the third, what they'd like the company to continue doing. Then all these post-it notes would be gathered up and considered by the senior team, and then appropriate actions would be taken accordingly. Now, for this exercise to work well, it's very important to set expectations and to explain to staff that just because something goes up on a post-it note, it doesn't follow that the senior team are obliged to agree to it. They are obliged to consider it, and if they reject it, to at least explain why it is that they're rejecting it. But this is a very good mechanism because it allows people to feel that they're being listened to, first of all, which is very important. But also it can garner some really good ideas. They can be very small ideas, or they can be huge ideas that could really help to develop new strategy for a company. But what is very important to remember to anybody who tries this and is new to it is that you must follow through. if you gather up the post-it notes and you start considering these suggestions, you must follow through and advise employees of the action that you plan to take as a result of this exercise, because there's one thing that is worse than not listening to staff, and that is pretending to listen to staff. So if you do this exercise badly, you could do a lot of damage. If you do it well, you could do an awful lot of good. So just to sum up there, what I'm advising is that you need to do three things to reduce your risk of litigation and also to make yourself more robust against litigation. Come in, you need to do a good, thorough equality and diversity audit, which has three component parts. You need to choose mediation or a resolution procedure over a grievance procedure, and you need to focus on employee voice. Okay, and I think that's enough of my voice. We've done 35 minutes. I'll hand you back to Kelly. Thank you very much for listening.
Barry, thank you. Let me take this opportunity as well to thank those who were listening who became involved in this morning's webinar by sending through questions. They were very interesting. As I said, we didn't get to answer all of them. We will get back to those who've sent us the questions individually. I know, Barry, you'll be happy enough to answer those.
Sure.
As Barry also said, if you would like a copy of that resolution procedure, I'd be delighted to email it to you. Just send me an email, kelly@legal-ireland.com. I'll also get in touch with each of you with regards some feedback as well. We'd like to get some feedback on Barry's session today, how you felt it was, even how you, was it too long, too short, how did you enjoy Barry's session and the content. So look out in your inbox, there'll be an email from me coming shortly. So again, thank you very much for listening, and thank you to Barry for today's webinar, and we look forward to seeing you at a Legal Ireland event. Thanks.